Hello and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to this third webinar as part of the strategic sourcing webinar series organized by ISM-INDIA in conjunction with BCube Global Solutions. My name is Ram Raghuraman and I'm happy to be here speaking in front of you. I hope you're off to a fine start this Saturday, and today we will be looking at category strategy and supply market analysis. In the previous two webinars, we talked about, we got a high-level overview of strategic sourcing, followed by an in-depth look at the first phase as you start your strategic sourcing journey, which is spend analysis. Now, the next step is once you have your spend data, try to look at creating categories in your spend and identifying specific strategies per category, as well as also identifying go-to-market strategies or sourcing strategies as we call them. A little bit about myself. I am one of the directors of ISM-INDIA. I'm based out of Chennai. In addition, I'm also the founder of BCube Global Solutions, procurement consulting and services company that I started recently. I was educated partly here in India as well as in the US, where I did my MBA from Purdue University. I was working in the US in multiple roles in procurement and supply management. I've been fortunate to work across the globe, working with vendors in China, India, Mexico, larger parts of North America, as well as Europe. And I've had multiple responsibilities managing categories, managing transportation and 3PL spend, performing plant-based purchasing, as well as strategic sourcing corporate roles. So without waiting any further, let me get started. We are going to be, this is a quick agenda for the day. As you know, we'll be talking about formulating category strategies and performing supply market analysis. Initially, we will look at building category profiles, which is important because it is imperative that you understand what you buy and try to identify relationships that may exist between the various purchases. You get that by segmenting your purchases and performing data analysis, and you identify, look for trends and try to seek relationships between within a category. And once you build category profiles, the next logical sequence step is to understand what is out there, what is the external environment like. So understand not only your existing supply base, but also the larger supply market in general. And this will help you in formulating specific strategies to maximize savings opportunities. Look at formulating category strategies and go-to-market strategies based on the profiles that you built and the analysis that you've done on your supply market. And not just, please understand that what I'm showing to you as a category strategy shouldn't be set in stone. It depends on the industry. It depends on the geography that you're buying from. So what I will tell you, please use that as a guideline, as you know, those are the key elements that incorporate that are part of a category strategy. So it's important that you understand how to go about and framing a category strategy, and then you could use that understanding and formulate category strategies for various categories. And also understand that you shouldn't have based on the category that is being purchased, the elements of a strategy may be different. So keep that in mind as well. Finally, we will look at Peter Kraljic's portfolio purchasing model. This was developed in the 80s, but I think it has still has relevance today in our with what little over 30 years from there, but still I think the strength of this model is such that it still maintains relevance today. And finally, we will have a quick recap of what we discussed in this webinar, and then we'll have an interactive Q&A session. Please do understand that while I would like this webinar to be very interactive, it's so that the first 45 minutes you would have to bear with me and hear me and my monologue. I will continue talking for the first 45 minutes, and for the remaining 15 minutes, or maybe a little bit beyond that, you can. The discussion will be open to the floor, and all the participants will be welcome. So please do understand, you could either post your questions during the webinar in the questions box that you can see on the console, or you can also raise your hand, in which case I will unmute you and you will have the opportunity to speak. I hope this is enough information, so why don't we get started. First, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at building category profiles and performing supply market analysis. So what is a category profile? To those of you that attended the previous webinar on spend analysis, this will be, you remember how we looked at spend data and creating the spend cube? The spend cube is nothing but from your spend data, which you collate from disparate sources and put together. You compile your spend data, put it together, and then analyze it. So you try to understand from who are we buying. Number two, for who are we buying? Number three, what are we buying? So from who, for who, and what are the three questions that help you create a spend cube with the data that you have. From who refers to typically the supplier that you buy from. For who is nothing but the cost center to which the purchase can be attributed. And lastly, understanding the category and the subcategory. So what are we buying? So armed with this knowledge, this is critical to strategic sourcing initiative. So, but then why am I mentioning this here? A category profile is just an extension of the spend cube. If you were to look at the various aspects of the category strategy, you will have volumes within your category in the past and what volumes will be purchased in your category in the future. The next area is suppliers. Understand, who the top suppliers are within your category in terms of purchase volumes, number of subcategories, units purchased. So you should know who the major suppliers within that category are. And this will help you. The more time you spend in building your category profile, the easier it will be for you to formulate your category strategy. The next area is pricing. So within your category, there may be, perhaps if products are not inherently similar, you should try to break this down into a subcategory level. So you need to compare. Arun, can you mute yourself? I'm able to hear a lot of background noise from your end. Thank you. So if products are not inherently similar within a category, you should look at subcategory level. But what you should do is compare the pricing across similar products and services and see if it all makes sense. Understand if, one similar products, the price of one is $10 while the other is $20. If there is a difference, understand if the difference does make sense. If it's a higher amount, if it's a larger product, or if it's a higher amount of, let's say, for example, steel in it, the price is going to be higher. So understand pricing within that category, and you should also consolidate contract information. Understand what proportion of products purchased within that category are under contracts and what are not. The next area is understanding supplier performance. So while you're trying to see who the top suppliers are, an extension of that is identify who are the better performing suppliers in terms of quality, delivery, customer support. So you might have to look at disparate sources of information to build up the category profile, but it is important that you do so. The fifth aspect, and one that we already talked about, is spend. Understand your spend across the various categories and subcategories, and try to be able to relate if the spend is all making sense. And the last part, where some of you may already be some of you may already be good at this, but for you'd have to make the initiative to understand the specifications of the product or the category that you purchase. And sometimes this might involve, engineering's assistance, or it might involve other stakeholders. So feel free to reach out to them and understand in depth what the various specifications are. For example, if let's say you're purchasing a book, it is important that you understand, what the paper weight that you're purchasing and the paper grade. Understand what finish and quality is expected out of the book. What is the size? What is the number of pages in the book? What are the various colors used while printing, and the other graphics. So this is, you'd have to understand the length and breadth of the category that you are purchasing, and I think that is really important. So once we do that, the next area is understanding your supply market, and this, I would say, it is a simple step, and there are many such techniques to understand the supply market, but one that is widely used is the Porter's 5 forces analysis, which you may have heard of. I'll just do a quick recap of Porter's 5 forces. Basically, it is one. So this will basically help you make sense of a particular market. So this is predominantly used for market analysis, but since our supply base is organized into markets, this makes really a lot of sense. Understand new entrants within the market, understand who the various buyers are in addition to yourself, who are the other buyers, understand who the substitutes are. If for example, you are purchasing a motorbike, and this is just a very loose example, what are the substitutes for a motorbike? A motorbike can be substituted with a car, a bicycle, and so on. So understand what are the various substitutes for that supply market, who the various suppliers are, try to understand who the top suppliers are, who are the middle ground suppliers, who are the, and lastly, you'll have to understand the rivalry within the supply market and how you can use it to your advantage. And the important thing to keep in mind while you're doing the Porter's 5 forces analysis on your supply market is try to understand what are the forces at work. What are the drivers that influence supplier competitiveness? What is the profile? So if there is somebody out there who is doing a better job at this than you, understand what their profile is, what makes them do that. Ultimately, what you should try to get at is how you can use the supply market dynamics to your advantage and get maximum value out of it for yourself as well as your organization. So I thought it would be nice to share something that this was done several years ago, maybe about 8 years ago when I was working in the US. We did Porter's. So just to give you, this is very nice to see, but how does it actually work? We did for an electrical components. I'm just sharing a sample with you. We did this. I don't remember when. But, this is how we understood the various supply dynamics. One, understanding the barriers to entry to being an electrical component supplier is there are low barriers of entry because the cost of setting up a plant is relatively lower compared to other and keep in mind, I will give you the perspective. The company that I worked for was a earth equipment manufacturer. It's called Terex. We compete with Caterpillar and so on. They make the big cranes, aerial work platforms, and other road building equipment. So one particular segment had electrical components which we did the analysis for. So relatively low barriers of entry. There are, what are the barriers, if any? That injection molding, tooling cost, dies, large number of dies because the products are not, the volumes weren't that high, and the economies of scale play an important role. And this was all for companies in the US. So having a global presence was becoming critical for electric and component manufacturers because in order to be able to produce at a much lower cost, they needed to involve lower cost countries in their supply chain. Supplier power was low because there is high competition and fragmentation. The primary inputs to make an electrical component is largely commodities, metals, resins, and semiconductors. But the supplier power is higher for certain other, let's say if you're buying wire harnesses, because of the manufacture of buying finished components, the supplier's power in those, particularly for wire harness, if you're a wire harness manufacturer, was higher, but largely supplier power was low, which means it is to the buying organization's advantage. Understanding internal competition, the market was largely dominated by a few big players and a large number of small manufacturers. The ongoing trend at that time was to consolidate and increase capacity utilization, and also, like I mentioned earlier, moving to lower cost regions. In terms of threats to substitution, there were virtually no alternatives from electrical components because you cannot make a machine without electrical components. So one area was perhaps product improvement. As we had seen, construction products were becoming more reliant on complex electrical systems, so product improvement was necessary, but not quite substitutions as such. Finally, buyer power was, we felt we had a high bargaining power because the product was undifferentiated. It's the switching costs are not that high because standards for drawing and devices were kind of similar, and I'm just reading through this, but I guess this is what I was going at. You understand the picture, right? This is how you understand a supply market. So I hope this gave you a good idea of building category profiles, and two, understanding your supply market and the dynamics that control it. So once you have done enough research and understood both these two, you are ready to formulate a strategy. How we do that is the next area, is understanding, creating a strategy. One, before we do that, before I show you what a category strategy should look like, what it should contain, what sourcing strategies are out there, what ones you should adopt, it's important that really people talk about, people throw the word strategy around a lot, but what is a strategy? It's not just limited to a category strategy, but what is a strategy in general? One, it is a document. I mean, if strategy was an unknown, if it was something intangible, it would make no sense. One, it is important that if there is a strategy, it has to be on paper. It is some organizations use it as a thought process or clearly don't define a strategy, but a strategy has to be defined, has to be on paper. 2, it is dynamic. There are elements of a strategy that should remain same, but there are elements that should evolve with time. And this is very similar to the way we approach ourselves, right? Our life in general, because you need to hold on to your values, but at the same time you should grow every day. So a strategy, category strategy is something very similar. Fundamentals should remain the same, but you should constantly review it, constantly analyze what is changing in the market, what is changing with what you buy, and modify your strategy accordingly. And as a practice, perhaps you should have a category strategy review at least twice a year, if not every quarter. At least twice a year, you should, this strategy document that you're going to build, you should constantly review it and see what has changed, how are you tracking with respect to your goals, and so on. The next area is your category strategy should be aligned with the larger goals and objectives of the procurement organization as such and your company as such. If for example, if your strategy is to introduce more suppliers, this is just one hypothetical scenario that I'm giving you. If for a particular category, the category manager decides, as part of my strategy, I should introduce more competition within my category. As a result, I will have more suppliers in. But largely, if the organizational goals are to consolidate spend among fewer suppliers and continue to rationalize your supply base, there will be a misalignment, and then you will not receive the support that you want from the senior management in achieving your strategy. So make sure while you're formulating your category strategy, it is constantly aligned with the greater purchasing department as well as your organization. And finally, make sure, this is important because make sure there is sufficient stakeholder involvement, as while not just when you're formulating your strategy, but also make sure you communicate your strategy effectively to everybody around you that may be affected, because it is important that they understand what you're trying to do. So engineering, sales and marketing, finance, operations, quality, and sometimes we, for certain categories, we involved a few of our top suppliers as well in formulating the category strategy. So these are largely some items to think about. Now that we've done this, let's understand what are the various elements if you're trying to build a category strategy. And again, I want to stress that this is something, I wouldn't want this to be set in stone. This will give you an idea of what are the various elements of a category strategy based on your industry and based on your category. Perhaps you should look at either including a few elements more, or certain elements that don't make sense, you should skip over them. So one, spend information. I've talked enough about spend information. Market information, which we already saw. Supplier SWOT analysis. If you are unable to understand the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and of your top suppliers, you should at least do this for your key suppliers. At least that cover 80% of your spend. You should do a SWOT analysis. The next area, next couple of areas that have cropped up are understand the value stream analysis of the category that you buy. When I say value stream, it is, for example, if I'm purchasing fabricated steel, a steel that requires some amount of welding, some amount of other processes. The value stream analysis of that category would largely involve break it down into as many value-adding steps as possible. One is raw material. Two, what you do with the raw material. So that is the labor component. So one will be welding, one will be cutting into strips. And so break down various sub-processes from which a product is taken from the raw material stage to the finished good, and try to break down the costs associated with each stage. So that is value stream analysis. And next is you also have to understand what the future trends are in your category strategy. List out the few trends that you see that are driving the cost for your particular category, not just the associated components and commodities as well, and try to extrapolate, try to see how the costs part of it will change in the coming year or two. And ultimately, understand a combination of all this should lead to action plans, clear action plans that are your strategic long-term and short-term goals. It's important that you define what long-term is, define what short-term is, so that you can be more effective. Your short-term goals are something that you can achieve within the coming year, but ultimately those should largely tie in with your long-term strategy for the category. They should, that long-term can be 3 years or 5 years, and ultimately for a category it should list out targets, goals, various milestones and metrics to measure the success. So all these put together is what I would call a dynamic category strategy. Moving on. Now that we understood our category, and now that we've understood the supply market, now that we've formed a category strategy, how then would you proceed to source effectively so as to make add value to your organization? So largely, if you look at sourcing strategies, they would fall into broadly two areas. One is exploit, the other is develop. So for example, you work with your suppliers to improve the specs of your product. You have VAV, value analysis, value engineering, try to optimize life cycle costs. This is a type of a sourcing strategy. The other would be a joint process improvement with your supplier, where you work together with the supplier to re-engineer, and and there is some amount of sharing of the gains that you see. You integrate logistics as well as part of the joint process improvement. And the other would be relationship restructuring, which is you look at your supply chain as a whole, and you include your tier 1, tier 2 suppliers as part of your supply chain. You view them as an extension of your company, rather than viewing them as separate. Try to form strategic alliances, do make versus buy analysis, see which processes you can insource. So this is a type of sourcing category, strategy. And on the other hand, you could also do global sourcing, understand, expand your supply base, move into lower cost regions, see where it makes sense, understand which categories, which subcategories or which parts can be moved overseas to get maximum value and profit from, there are certain regions of the world, there are supply-demand imbalances, see how you can maximize from those. And you should also, one other sourcing strategy, which I guess by default everybody does, is based on best price evaluation or best cost. I don't know why I put price in there, but again, understand the total costs, find out the should costs, negotiate pricing, unbundle pricing. This is one of the other strategies. And the last one is volume concentration, consolidation. Consolidate the number of suppliers. If you have a supply base that has 10 different suppliers, out of which 8 are inherently similar, if you look at consolidating volumes and moving to a fewer number of suppliers, because there is a cost associated with working with a particular supplier. Now, like I mentioned, sourcing strategies are largely into two major chunks, right? So you might have noticed this trend here. So all the items on the right were joint or co-development creating an advantage, while this side on the left, it's all about exploiting buyer power. There may be more other strategies because there is a lot of gray area, but largely it would fall under these two broad regions. So once we do have, we understand that there are largely two. One important aspect of selection of sourcing strategy is to understand the right sourcing event type. So there are procurement professionals, all over the world are trying to move more into auctions, reverse auctions. If for the people here that already know what a reverse auction means, this may be redundant, but a reverse auction is something very similar to an auction that you see where people bid for a particular product. Only in this case, the price will continue to go down. So your suppliers are the ones that will be bidding, and the price, the competing suppliers try to bring the supplier down. So ultimately, an auction makes sure you get a particular product or commodity at the lowest possible cost. So when to choose? There are two types, still largely two types. There are e-auctions and there are traditional RFP. So for ones that you're unable to put a finger on either, there are elements of mixed mode that you can adopt. So you could use some elements of auction, some elements of the RFP. All in all, what your goal should be is to make sure you get the best value. Value is the number one important thing at the lowest possible cost. So we will look at 5 elements, try to and see what makes sense. So one, for example, as you're trying to bid a particular category, how much of part detailed information do you have with drawings or specifications? If they are simple, they are very clear, they will automatically fall under an e-auction. If they are detailed or complex, it makes more sense to do a traditional RFP with them. Bidding is another area. So there are some products or categories that will take weeks to bid or rebid. You have questions, a lot of questions. If it's very short, it makes sense to do an e-auction. If it's somebody can decide whether they can drop the price within a minute, you should consider an e-auction for that category. Or if it involves multiple clarification, then it makes sense to do a traditional RFP. The next we'll see is pricing components. Understand, if for a particular product within your category, if there are various number of cost elements or a large amount of detail required, it wouldn't make sense to do an e-auction. If there are few, you can do. If there are multiple and complex, it makes sense to do a traditional RFP. A traditional RFP, I hope all of you know, is nothing but you send your specs to the various suppliers. You can either do it online or do it email, whichever way you do it, and then you give them some time to respond, and let's say a week or a month, and after a month the suppliers all respond with their quotes, you analyze, and then you choose the right supplier. That is a traditional RFP versus e-auction, which involves a lot of preparation, I might add. For a successful e-auction, I've done a few within my category. Practice is important as well as preparation. You need to be prepared. Try to, all these information that I'm listing, you should try to, for example, part detail information might be out there, but you might not make an effort to understand and consolidate. Once you do that, you can generate more e-auctions. And then the other important criteria for choosing which type of sourcing event is your analysis, right? Your pricing analysis. What is the level of detail? Is it easily comparable, or does it involve a lot of calculations on top of? If you're able to break it down into various small silos, then great. But if not, if there is greater level of granularity and a lot of analysis, then e-auction might not be the case. If it's simple, real-time and fully automated, you could very well do an e-auction. On the other hand, if it's a bit sophisticated, if it's a lot of manual inputs to calculate pricing analysis, understand the total cost, then perhaps you should do a traditional RFP. And the last criteria which is important is understanding what type of information you share with your suppliers. If you're welcome sharing the price of a particular product, or if you're happy doing it on the web for everybody to see, if it's e-auction. But on the other hand, if you want to reach out to individual suppliers separately, give them feedback, then perhaps you should consider doing a traditional RFP. This is not often, as with everything, not often do categories or products fall clearly on this side or that side. There may be certain areas where you should try to adopt a mixed mode, but the inherent deciding factor is that e-auctions, if done right, can generate the maximum number of savings, because in a real time, suppliers revise their bid and they see what their competition is bidding, so automatically they will try to move to their best possible price within a short span of time, whereas in a traditional RFP that might take multiple iterations. I think coming close to the end of, but before I go, I want to share with you the Kraljic's purchasing portfolio model. This you might have seen. This was done in 1983. So even with the advent of technology, even with the changes that we've seen, largely there are a few elements of this purchasing model that make sense. So I will quickly rush through this as we are coming closer to the end of the presentation. So the model as such, and this will be something very similar to what we've discussed in the past in trying to understand the supply market, formulating category as well as supply market strategy. So this is, again, this was Peter Kraljic who said there is a 4-step method. So one is classification, which we saw. Largely, if you look at your supply base within a particular category, they will fall within 4 blocks. So if you plot supply risk is the risk at which if there is greater competition among the supply base, if there is low number of suppliers, then if there is lower number of suppliers, then supply risk is said to be high. On the other hand, if there's a lot of competition within the supply base, if there are a lot of substitutes and so on, supply risk is considered low. So that is what I define by supply risk. Versus the profit impact. Profit is what is the amount of savings that working on a particular category can generate. And they may be different for different categories, but largely within a subcategory, if you analyze this, so there are 4 major blocks with which your supply base will fall under. So going from left top to bottom, so leverage is 1, strategic is 1, non-critical is 1, bottleneck is 1. So your suppliers will fall into 4 major buckets within your category. You will have leverage suppliers, you will have strategic suppliers, you will have non-critical suppliers, and you will have bottleneck suppliers. And this you should read. So bottleneck suppliers are those that have low profit impact but have high supply risk. Your sweet spot is the leverage suppliers, typically where there is low supply risk but high profit impact. And the ones that are high supply risk and high profit impact are strategic suppliers, the ones that you need to really work together with, while those that have both low will be non-critical. So we will understand how you formulate strategies based on where these guys fall under. So the next is, we've already seen, you understand the market, right, supply market. I'll skip through this. The other is positioning. So there are, as we saw earlier, so Kraljic used the word diversify. So there are 2 strategies that you need to adopt. One is exploit, the other is diversify, and where you're not able to reach a clear consensus on which strategy to adopt, you do a mix of both, so exploit or balance. So if you notice, this is again, so this graph and this are somewhat related. So you will want to exploit your leverage suppliers. With your strategic suppliers, it should be a bit of both. With your where the bottleneck suppliers, you should try to diversify, and so on. So you get the gist, right? But again, when you say exploit, what does it mean? When you say diversify, what does it mean? So exploit is when you know, there is a lot of text there. I'll try to read it out. So you make the most of your high buying power and secure, get into longer term contracts because you're ultimately reducing the supply risk, and still you should be able to make spot purchases. Even if you have contracts signed, if it makes sense to buy on the spot buying, they call it, you should still be able to do it, and those you can do it with your leverage suppliers. On the other hand, if you want to diversify, these are for products that have high supply risk, right? So you want to reduce the supply risk by seeking alternative suppliers of products. You can also increase your buying power by consolidation. And one other area, if you have the capability to do this in-house, you could either bring the product or service in-house or continue to purchase at a high supply risk. And there is also certain categories where it makes sense to strike the middle ground. So try to see where it makes sense to exploit, try to see where it makes sense to diversify. Each category is different. Maybe you need to adopt a middle ground strategy for most categories, but again, largely this is how you approach a particular category strategy for a model. So one, you classify, you try to understand which suppliers fall into which 4x4 block, understand the market, position yourself, and execute the strategy. With this, I think, bang, about 12 o'clock, I took a couple of minutes extra, but with this, we come to the end of our presentation. What I will do is a quick recap of let me see if I can start from the beginning. Oops, sorry. So I'll just do a quick recap of what we did. First, we understood how to build category profiles and supply market analysis. And I mentioned, category profiles are an extension of the spend cube that we saw last time. Category profile includes, you understand the volumes, you understand the suppliers, you understand pricing within a category, you understand supplier performance, right? Yeah. And then you also try to understand spend information as well as try to understand specifications. Largely with these 6 components, you will be able to build a solid category profile. And in addition, you also perform Porter's 5 force analysis to understand the dynamics of your supply market, understand who the new entrants are, who are the buyers, what is the power of a buyer, are there any substitutes to a purchased product or category or commodity, and then understand who the various suppliers are. And understand the supply market rivalry with a focus on understanding what are the inherent forces, what drives cost, what do successful companies do, and how you can use competition within the supply market to your advantage. I just walked you through a sample that we did, just to make sure that you were able to relate to it. And we saw what are the various elements of a strategy, and what a strategy is. It's a document, it's dynamic, it should constantly evolve. The goals and objectives should largely align with those of your organization, and it should involve multiple people, which is when you need, because while formulation of a strategy, if a lot of people are involved in the formulation, they will automatically be inclined to work with you during implementation. So we looked at various elements of a category strategy: spend information, market information, supplier SWOT, value stream, future trends, And ultimately, all these together should evolve into clear strategies, longer term and short term. We also looked at sourcing strategies, which largely fall into two. One is exploitation, one is creating advantage or diversifying. And we then looked at choosing the right type of sourcing event based on several criteria that we have, understanding your part information, bidding, pricing components, pricing analysis, and information you want to give to your suppliers. And in the end, we looked at Kraljic's portfolio purchasing model, which is largely a 4-step model: classification, understanding market rivalry, positioning yourself, and planning to make sure you get the most out of this. So with that, we come to the end of this presentation, and I will now take a look at your questions. But before that, I just want to make sure I put my contact information in here. Do note this: if you have any questions that are not resolved during the Q&A session, or if you have any clarifications, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is ram@bcubeglobal.com, and alternatively, you could also call me on my mobile phone